The clock had just struck 7 when I heard the gentle tap at my front door. Not the confident rap of someone certain of their welcome, but rather a tentative sound hesitant, as though the person on the other side was second-guessing their decision to be there at all. I was folding laundry in the living room, the familiar scent of lavender fabric softener filling the air. Through my window, the late afternoon sky painted itself in shades of coral and gold, the kind of autumn sunset that made everything feel suspended in amber. My world had grown quiet and predictable since David's passing 3 years ago. A gentle rhythm of morning walks, afternoon reading, and evening phone calls with my sister Claire. That soft knock disrupted everything. Setting down the towel I'd been folding, I smoothed my sweater and walked to the door. I rarely had unexpected visitors these days. When I opened it, there stood Michael, my neighbor from across the street. We'd shared polite waves while collecting mail and brief conversations about the weather when we happened to cross paths. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, recently divorced according to neighborhood gossip, and had moved in about 18 months ago. Always courteous, always keeping to himself, tonight he looked uncertain, holding a small wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Hello, Margaret," he said, his voice slightly rough as if he'd been rehearsing what to say. "I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I baked way too many muffins today and wondered if you might enjoy some." I stared at him. Muffins? It was the last thing I'd anticipated. My pulse quickened, not from attraction, not yet, but from pure surprise. A man appearing at my doorstep with homemade treats as the sun set? That hadn't occurred since my university days. I found myself grinning, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. "How thoughtful of you, Michael. I'd be delighted to have some. Would you care to join me for coffee? I have a fresh pot brewing, if you're not rushing off somewhere." He paused for just a moment, long enough to make me question whether I'd overstepped. Then he smiled. "Coffee sounds wonderful." We settled in my breakfast nook where the remaining daylight filtered through sheer curtains, casting everything in a warm amber glow. I served coffee in the same blue ceramic mugs David and I had used for our evening conversations. There was something oddly soothing about it, recognizable yet transformed. Michael wasn't particularly chatty, and I'd grown quieter over the years myself, but the silence felt natural rather than awkward. In truth, it seemed welcoming, as if we were both sharing something meaningful without requiring words. He mentioned that he'd recently taken up baking as a way to settle his mind after stressful days at his home office. I hung on every word, observing how his expression grew thoughtful when he spoke about his son, who spent most weekends with his ex-wife. "I find myself missing him constantly," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's peculiar, isn't it? You nurture them, pour your heart into raising them, and then suddenly they're living a different life entirely." I understood his pain more deeply. Then he could know that hollow ache parents carry when children grow into their own worlds. "That's not peculiar at all," I said softly. "It's simply what being a parent means. The most difficult part, I believe, is learning to let go." Our gazes connected for just an instant, and I glimpsed something there, understanding, perhaps, a shared melancholy hidden beneath years of resilience and the effort to move forward. When he departed an hour later after finishing 3 muffins and accepting 2 coffee refills, I felt something awakening within me that had been dormant for far too long. A warmth spreading through my chest, a tiny spark. That evening, as I prepared for bed with his basket still sitting on my kitchen counter, containing 1 remaining muffin, I lay staring at the ceiling and wondered, was this merely kindness or something more? I reminded myself not to read too much into it. At 58, I was probably just being neighborly, nothing more. But a quiet voice in the depths of my mind whispered something I hadn't allowed myself to hear in years. "It's acceptable to feel." Again, and for the first time in ages, I didn't silence that voice. A week went by before I encountered Michael again. I'd convinced myself that our coffee and muffins had been a singular occurrence, a brief moment of neighborly goodwill. Yet every time I passed the breakfast nook or glanced toward his house across the street, I experienced that same soft, unfamiliar flutter in my stomach. It was ridiculous. I scolded myself adolescent behavior, but that didn't prevent me from paying closer attention to sounds outside or spending extra time styling my hair each morning. Then came Thursday. The weather had turned unexpectedly mild, offering glimpses of the approaching summer. I'd spent the early afternoon deadheading the roses along my front walk when I heard someone call out, "Could you use some assistance?" I turned to see Michael standing at the edge of his driveway, shirt sleeves pushed up, holding a rake, and wearing an amused expression. I'm attempting to make my landscaping look half as attractive as yours, he continued, gesturing toward the bursts of pink and white blooms lining my pathway. But I suspect I'm just creating chaos and hoping for divine intervention. I laughed, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. Well, divine intervention and good fertilizer are essentially the same thing around here. He chuckled and propped the rake against his mailbox. Actually, I was wondering something else. Would you be interested in having dinner with me tomorrow evening? Nothing elaborate, just something I'm planning to cook. I'd appreciate the company. I froze momentarily. I thought I'd misunderstood him, or that my imagination was playing tricks. But his eyes were sincere, nervous yet hopeful. Eating dinner with a man at his home, I hadn't found myself in that situation in well over a decade. I smiled, more slowly this time. I'd love that, Michael. Michael's home reflected his personality perfectly, tidy and unpretentious, with small personal details that revealed more than he probably intended. Family photographs of his son decorated the hallway, and an overflowing bookshelf of cooking magazines occupied the living room corner. On the dining table, he'd placed candles, just two, nothing elaborate, and prepared a casserole that filled the house with the kind of fragrance that immediately makes you feel welcome. As we dined, conversation flowed more naturally than before. We discussed our histories, not just the basic facts, but the emotions between them. I used to dream about retiring to the mountains, he said with a nostalgic smile, opening a small bookshop by a lake. But life had different plans. I nodded. David and I thought we'd sail around the Caribbean islands. We even started taking sailing lessons. Then his stroke changed everything too quickly. The words emerged more easily than expected. Usually, I avoided discussing David. It felt like betrayal somehow. But with Michael, it didn't. He didn't look uncomfortable or offer empty platitudes. He simply listened. After dinner, we moved to his back deck. The sky had deepened to rich indigo, stars beginning to emerge. The silence felt comfortable again, accompanied by the gentle chorus of crickets and distant wind chimes from somewhere in the neighborhood. I'm grateful you came, he said quietly, his voice low. It's been so long since this place felt like more than just somewhere to sleep. I studied him, then really studied him. The gentle creases around his eyes, the way his hands rested calmly on the chair arms, steady and sure. Then he surprised me again. He reached for my hand, not grasping or pulling, but letting his fingers brush against mine in a gentle invitation. I hesitated, not from unwillingness, but because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched with such tenderness. There was no urgency, only warmth and respect. The kind of connection that says, I see you, and I want to understand who you are. I allowed my fingers to intertwine with his. We remained like that for quite a while. Hands joined between us, two people connected by something unspoken, something genuine. When I finally walked home beneath the starlight, my heart wasn't racing with anxiety or uncertainty, but pulsing with an unusual kind of peace, a steadiness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. That night, I opened my journal for the first time in months and wrote just one sentence. Something is awakening within me. Again, I didn't know where this path would lead, but I understood this much. It wasn't simply about a neighbor anymore. It was about possibility, about rediscovering parts of myself I thought had disappeared with time, and for the first time in ages, I was eager to see what tomorrow might bring. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since that evening on Michael's deck, since that tender touch, since I'd allowed someone to see me, truly see me, even just a little. In the peaceful days that followed, life settled into a different rhythm, marked by subtle changes and small kindnesses. Michael would wave from his study window when I tended my herb garden. He left a fresh banana bread on my doorstep one morning, with a handwritten note, still experimenting, let me know if I'm improving. It wasn't dramatic or sweeping like the romances in movies, but it was real. One afternoon, after a gentle rain had left the streets glistening and the air perfumed with wet earth and honeysuckle, he called. I know this is spontaneous, he said, but I could really use a walk. Would you mind some company? I didn't even pause to consider. I'll get my shoes. We met at the corner where the old maple trees formed a natural canopy over the sidewalk. The clouds were dispersing, allowing streams of sunlight to dance across the wet pavement. Everything seemed freshly cleansed. We strolled leisurely, not from caution, but because neither of us felt rushed to reach any particular destination. There was something in the atmosphere that day, some quiet energy that made everything feel more vibrant. Initially, we discussed simple topics: his freelance work, my attempts at growing herbs indoors. Then, as we entered the path through the community park, our conversation naturally deepened. I used to hike this trail with him, Michael said softly, referring to his son. When he was small, he loved gathering leaves and pretending they had magical powers. Once he gave me one and told me it would shield me from adult worries. He smiled, though sadness lingered in his expression. Do you still have it? I asked gently. He nodded. In my desk drawer. Every time I consider throwing it away, I can't bring myself to do it. I stopped walking and took his hand, as I had that night on his deck. This time, there was no hesitation. I believe it's still working, I said. He stopped too, right there beneath a flowering cherry tree, and looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. Margaret, I didn't think I could feel this way again. I never expected to. You and we've both experienced so much. I smiled. We have. And we've lost plenty too. But perhaps that's exactly why this matters. He nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket and withdrew something, a small, polished leaf, barely larger than a silver dollar. He examined it briefly, then gently placed it in my palm. You deserve protection too, he said. My throat tightened. I wasn't accustomed to such gentleness anymore. But in that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared acknowledge. I was learning to trust again. We continued walking, hands clasped, the leaf warm against my skin. We passed joggers, families with strollers, the scent of fresh grass and damp earth surrounding us. Somewhere along that winding path, it occurred to me I wasn't just letting someone into my life. I was allowing myself to emerge from the shell I'd built, permitting myself to laugh without guilt, to be seen without shame, to hope without fear. When we reached the trail's end, the sun had begun its descent, creating long shadows across the pavement. I don't want this afternoon to end, he said. I turned to him and smiled. Then don't let it. He took a breath and moved closer, his eyes searching mine, not rushing, not demanding, simply asking a silent question. I nodded, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt the soft, hesitant pressure of lips against mine. Not fireworks or cinematic passion, but warmth, recognition, a promise of something that might grow slowly, quietly, if we nurtured it. That night, I didn't need to write in my journal, because I already knew what the next entry would say. I think I'm falling, and this time I'm not afraid. The morning after that kiss, everything appeared slightly different. Not that the world had changed, but rather how I was perceiving it. The way I lingered at the kitchen window with my tea, watching early light spread across my garden. The way my steps felt lighter, the air seemed cleaner, despite the weather forecast predicting overcast skies. Something within me had transformed. Perhaps that's what happens when you begin allowing yourself to feel again, not just happiness, but vulnerability too. The uncertainty, the possibility. Michael called that afternoon, his voice gentler than usual. May I come by? I said yes before he finished asking. He arrived with 2 cups of tea and a tentative smile. I hope this doesn't seem too rushed, he said, offering me a cup. I just couldn't stop thinking about yesterday evening. I motioned to the chair beside mine on the front porch. Neither could I. We sat quietly for a long time, sipping our tea, letting the silence communicate what words might complicate. Then he looked at me directly. You frightened me a little, Margaret, he said. I raised an eyebrow, half laughing. Me? He nodded. Because this feels genuine, and I haven't allowed anything to feel genuine in such a long time. I understood that sentiment better than I could articulate. I'd constructed my life after David around comfortable routines, safe boundaries, predictable days. It was an existence that didn't demand too much of me and didn't offer too much in return, just enough to get by. Michael represented more. I'm frightened too, I admitted. But maybe that's actually a positive sign. He smiled, and the worry in his eyes softened. We spent the remainder of that afternoon discussing things we rarely voiced aloud. The grief that never fully disappears, but changes form over time, the aspects of ourselves we'd kept hidden for years, the dreams we'd buried so deeply we'd forgotten they still existed. Gradually, a picture emerged, not of a love story painted in bold, dramatic brush strokes, but one created with gentle colors. A story not about second chances, but about fresh starts. That weekend, we visited the local antique fair together. Nothing extraordinary, just browsing vintage books and handmade pottery and the sound of folk music drifting through the open air, but it felt right, like the kind of ordinary moment that transforms into cherished memory. As autumn deepened into winter, our lives began to interweave in small but significant ways. Saturday morning breakfasts, shared newspaper puzzles, a new novel left on my porch with a note saying, "Thought this might interest you." We didn't hurry anything. We didn't need to. True love doesn't always arrive with thunderbolts or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in measured, steady steps, in a shared glance across a dinner table, in knowing someone will greet you at the door when the day has been difficult. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the first snow begin to fall, he reached for my hand again. This time, there was no uncertainty from either of us. "You know," he said, "I believe we discovered each other precisely when we needed to." I smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "No, I think we chose to truly see each other when we were finally prepared to." He nodded, and the winter night enveloped us like a warm embrace. Not everything had changed. The world outside continued its familiar rotation. My garden still required tending. The clock still moved forward relentlessly. But inside me, something had opened, and I knew with absolute certainty that this chapter of my life was no less valuable than any that had come before. In fact, perhaps, it was the beginning of my most authentic chapter, yet one built not on youth or perfect timing or flawless circumstances, but on understanding, on bravery, on the quiet miracle of two people who'd lived long enough to finally recognize what truly matters. So to anyone who might be listening, I offer this. Don't abandon hope for connection. Don't close your heart to something simply because it arrived later than you expected. Sometimes the most unexpected gesture becomes the beginning of everything you never knew you were waiting for. The beauty of love isn't always in its timing. Sometimes it's in its persistence, in its ability to find us when we're finally ready to be found. And when it does, when it knocks softly at your door on an ordinary evening, let it in. Let yourself feel again. Let yourself begin again, because some stories are worth the wait.